So other than the handful of times she'd woken up and the few times she'd found strange items beside her bed in the morning, she didn't know what she got up to, how often she got up to it, or whether she was responding to something real or imagined. Which was why she wasn't aware that ever since Rich's arrest, she'd been getting up almost nightly to guard her children's bedroom doors. Now it's time for Puppets, Pupils, and Producers, a story of mind over matter. In college, Cassie learned parasomnias could be caused by medical issues or mental disorders, and that they ran in families, which wasn't surprising since her father not only talked, but argued and sang in his sleep, and her brother Stan had issues with bedwetting and grinding his teeth. Cassie found out she engaged in somniloquy from her enticing friends, who in the morning would recite all the kooky stuff she said in her sleep, which sometimes she'd sort of remember saying, but most of the time didn't. Despite not knowing she was a sleep talker until she was in her teens, she knew she'd walked in her sleep ever since she was a kid. And although it wasn't uncommon for children to walk in their sleep up until they reached puberty even, Cassie was one of the very few who didn't outgrow it. Considered a disorder of arousal, Cassie's somnambulism occurred during the first third of her night, when her brain was in the deepest stage of sleep. Known as the non-REM stage, it was the time when her brain was the least active and did not dream. Her body, however, wasn't fully relaxed yet, which was why it was also the time when she tossed and turned the most. It was during this stage that something would startle her, but her sleeping brain wouldn't respond because it was in a deep sleep. Her body, on the other hand, would still be awake, so it would take action. Her wandering lasted anywhere from a few seconds to almost 30 minutes, and for the most part, she wasn't aware she was out of her bed. However, over the years, she'd woken up on several occasions, so she knew she did it, but she didn't know how often it happened. When she did wake up, she'd eventually realize she was doing something silly, and she'd go back to bed. Sometimes on those occasions, her brain would wake up all the way, and after her confusion cleared, she'd lie in bed trying to figure out what she'd been doing and why. Other times her brain would quickly fall back asleep, and in the morning something would remind her she caught herself wandering again. From what she could tell, her walking occurred when her life was particularly stressful. For instance, prior to an important meet, she'd woken up while doing a mental run-through of her floor routine. When she was being stalked by Dr. Pepper, she'd woken up while making sure the doors were locked. And after an overwhelming shift during her training, she'd woken up thinking she was giving pills to her patients. But because her brain body was in a dissociative state, she'd never know if she was startled by something that actually stimulated her body's sensory nerves, such as a noise, smell, or movement, or whether it was something her hypervigilant subconscious mind had imagined. So other than the handful of times she'd woken up and the few times she'd found strange items beside her bed in the morning, she didn't know what she got up to, how often she got up to it, or whether she was responding to something real or imagined. Which was why she wasn't aware that ever since Rich's arrest, she'd been getting up almost nightly, to guard her children's bedroom doors. When she was awake, her conscious mind couldn't decide if she was a legitimate victim or a drama queen. She'd think he hadn't hurt her badly, and it could have been much worse. Then she'd remember her children's fearful faces and their screaming. Visions of her father beating her mother would flash on her mind's screen, and she'd think about her baby seeing those things, and she'd vow that this time she'd follow through. But because her trauma-tinted glasses were the benevolent type, she believed that once she told the truth about her husband, the legal system would protect her, and those who loved her would support her decision. Unfortunately, they also prevented her from seeing that Rich wore the malevolent version of the glasses, so his perspective was sullied by bad intentions. He thought she'd used him instead of the other way around, and had planned to replace him with another man all along. As a result, he was her victim, and her destruction was the only way he'd recover from his mortification. After she called her lawyer, who instructed her to call the police, Cassie called her 3 best friends. Then she called her father, who came to her rescue, but not necessarily to her defense, because that would be calling the kettle black, and his history of abuse was not something they spoke about. Cassie's lawyer called later that afternoon and suggested, in light of the morning's events, she reconsider sole custody and child support. Once again, the term domestic abuse was used, and another evidential warning about men like Rich and their propensity to use children as pawns was issued. While she agreed he'd crossed the line by hurting her in front of the kids, she also worked with fathers who struggled financially while their exes enjoyed financial abundance. So she disagreed with child support unless there was a huge disparity between incomes or living arrangements, and that was not the case with her and Rich. Conversely, she worked with some fathers who used their support payments to control their exes, and she suspected Rich would do the same. She also didn't like the term visitation and wanted their kids to live with both parents equally. In a perfect world, their location would change, but their lifestyle wouldn't. And she'd soon learn that her perfect world was unrealistic with a man like Rich. After his arrest, Rich called the Crown attorney, who just so happened to be a member at the country club, who then vouched for his integrity and authorized his release pending a hearing. Upon Rich's release, the arresting officer called Cassie to warn her, and after commenting he must have friends in high places, he suggested someone stay with her and emphasized if he showed up, she should call 911 immediately. Despite the Crown Attorney's instructions, Rich called the house from a payphone, and Cassie recorded their conversation on her answering machine. He said he was sorry he lost his temper, but she'd lied to him about there being another man, and now he couldn't trust her with any issues. She reassured she respected his role as their father and admitted she didn't want him to go to jail, but things changed when he hurt her in front of the kids. He said getting arrested made him realize he needed help, and he pleaded with her to drop the charges. Cassie spoke with the arresting officer, who said she'd have to take it up with the judge. He added it was common for victims of domestic abuse to make such calls. When he asked if Rich had pressured her to do so, she admitted he'd called to apologize, but hadn't threatened her in any way. Recognizing the patterns, the officer suggested she talk to a professional or join a support group. But she wasn't there yet, and even if she was a single mother with a full-time job and didn't have the time. Had she gone for counseling or found a support group, she might have realized that just like her, it was common for victims of domestic abuse to lie about the abuse, to believe it won't happen again, to try leaving several times, to think the abuse is their fault, to excuse the abuser's behavior, and to trust their abuser despite their untrustworthiness. Maybe she'd also see how, just like Rich, it was common for abusers to promise they'd change when they had no intention of doing so, to use manipulation or gaslighting techniques, to isolate their victim, to recruit friends and family to be on their side, and to turn the tables and become the victim instead of the offender. But she didn't go, and she didn't know what she didn't know. And because she'd never considered lying to the police herself, she was shocked to learn that once Rich realized he'd have to face his charges, his story changed. And along with denying his assault, he told everyone she'd attacked him because she was mentally unstable. She wasn't surprised his family distanced themselves, or that, as promised, his brother denied knowing anything about Rich's other incidents. However, she was devastated when she found out he'd been calling her best friends on a daily basis, and not one of them had mentioned it. Unfortunately, she didn't learn of his lies and spies until she received a letter from his lawyer indicating that he wanted sole custody of the children and a substantial amount of child support because Cassie was an unfit mother. The paragraph that followed described how, other than one incident way back in high school, her best friends hadn't seen any evidence of abuse, nor had Cassie ever spoken of it again. They were prepared to testify that from what they could see, Rich was a good husband and father, and it was Cassie's lying they were most concerned about. The next paragraph named the men she'd cheated with, and the one following described her affair with Sam, who, according to the letter, was also mentally unstable because he apparently was under the care of a psychiatrist. Wicca, spellcasting, and believing she received messages from the dead were in there too. And last but not least, the letter described how she was under investigation at work because she'd lied to a nun. Similar to her waking during an episode of wandering, it took a few minutes before Cassie's confused brain realized she was under attack and needed to wake up. She reread the paragraphs and sorted the claims into facts and fiction, and as she did, her glasses became a shade darker, and she could finally see that Rich had an army of believers and betrayers standing behind him. Cassie called her lawyer and agreed to seeking full custody and child support. Then, without mentioning the letter or that she knew they were spying for Rich, she invited her 3 best friends over for dinner on the weekend, where she determined who was a believer and who was a betrayer, because she'd told each one a different secret based on a lie. The first lie involved her questioning her sexuality. The second was that she was going to lose her job and her nursing license. The third was that she'd realized she didn't want a divorce and would get back together with Rich if he admitted the truth and got help. After she put her babies down for a nap, she collected the documents her lawyer required, and as requested, She made a list of every time Rich had hurt her. Once again, the process of admitting the truth shifted her perspective another shade darker, and she could finally see she was a victim of domestic abuse. When she finished writing, she placed the papers in a large envelope and went looking for the tiny cassette tape containing Rich's confession. She felt around for it and finally pulled up a chair to look for it, but it wasn't on top of the fridge where she'd put it. She looked all around, under and behind the fridge, but it was gone. Then she realized the only people who knew of its existence were her 3 best friends. Hola, hola! If you're enjoying A Story of Mind Over Matter, please remember to like the video and to follow me so you'll know when I release the next chapter.